Welcome everyone to today. Today is the last of our seminars of this term as part of the seminar series. It's a real pleasure to be able to welcome Dr. Sara Salem to our online seminar series. Today she's going to give a talk entitled Traces of a Faded Past, Materiality, Memory and Anti-Colonial Egypt. For those of you who don't know her, Sara's recently published a really great book, Anti-Colonial Afterlives in Egypt, The Politics of Hegemony, which is a really fascinating book, which I know loads of the students really enjoy reading. Sara is an assistant professor at the LSE, where she joined in 2018, and her main research interests include political sociology, post-colonial studies, Marxist theory, feminist theory, and global histories of empire and imperialism. And she is on the editorial board at Sociological Review and Historical Materialism. Many of us know Sara's work through particularly Stretching Marxism in the Post-Colonial World, which is a paper that's taught widely across the undergraduate curriculum. And so it's really great to actually be able to hear from Sara herself. So should I pass over to you, Sara? If we have people on YouTube, please do feel free to put any kind of questions you have throughout the talk into the chat function, and I'll keep an eye on it. But for those of you on Zoom, we'll do a Q&A in the regular style afterwards, where you can raise your hand or simply type your question into the chat function. So Sara, I'll pass over to you now.
Great, thank you so much, Ali, for the invitation. It's really exciting to be here and yeah, to present this work, which is really, I know everyone says this, but actually is very underdeveloped and kind of an initial project that I'm working on. So I would love to, yeah, hear what everyone thinks and to have a conversation around it. So I'm just gonna share my screen just because I have some images. Great. So essentially, this project is interested more broadly in the idea of archiving anti-colonialism. And this is based on a course that I teach here at the LSE, which is called the Anti-Colonial Archive. And I think emerged out of an interest in how we might think about, or how people have thought about archiving very differently when it's about the anti-colonial past or the different anti-colonial pasts. And this is something that I've started to think a lot of in relation to Egypt, both in response to kind of the increasingly restricted archives, especially the national archives, but also the courses we had really interesting discussions around what it means to archive things like smell, touch, taste. I mean, these other kind of sensorial experiences that are part of political transformation. So it's definitely emerged out of teaching, which has been really nice. So what I'm going to present today is a part of this project, which thinks about anti-colonial archives through two types of archives. One is an archive of street names across different African countries, and another is an archive of memories or political contestations that we see in strikes across Egypt over the last few decades. So I think partly this project has emerged from an interest in obviously the afterlife of revolution. And although in my own life, it's been the 2011 revolution in Egypt, a lot of my work has focused on the 1952 revolution as well, when Egypt became independent, and we see this new anti-colonial, post-colonial project emerge around Gamal Abdel Nasser and the free officers. And a lot of my previous work was interested in more of the political economy of this project of decolonization and how it brought together certain ideas about independence, about the economy, about political contestation into this very powerful project. This project is also interested in the power of anti-colonialism or of the anti-colonial moment, but a bit more through this idea of fragments, traces, or histories that live on in the present, not necessarily in these institutionalized ways or in ways that we can trace through laws or documents, but more actually in popular memory or in the space around us. So how things like street names or visual images that kind of live on in the city space or in towns continue to kind of remind people in different ways of this anti-colonial past. And I've thought about this project in a lot of different ways. I've thought about it through the idea of haunting, which I've taken from Avery Gordon's book, Ghostly Matters, but also work like Arwa Saleh's memoir, The Stillborn. Arwa Saleh was an Egyptian communist who wrote a really incredible memoir about her time in the student movement in the 70s. And I think these types of texts that think a bit more about revolutions as visceral or as felt have been really helpful in thinking about these types of traces in the present. So for example, Avery Gordon talks about how something like haunting as a methodology allows us to look out for the shadows, energies, ethereal forces, textures, spirits, and sensations that we might see in the past. So I think here there's a challenge, of course, to what we consider to be empirical in disciplines such as sociology, but it's also, I think, a challenge to this idea that anti-colonial pasts reside in the past. So how can searching for what haunts us invite us to clarify how the legacies of anti-colonial projects have afterlives that are not always visible or measurable? But also, how does haunting provide a framing through which we might understand how we feel when we encounter these traces of the anti-colonial in the present, often unexpectedly? How can we think through these feelings, and how can we think of these traces as part of an archive? Or actually, should we think of them as part of an archive? I think that's very much an open question, which I'll come back to at the end. Along these lines, Lisa Lowe has noted the importance of imagining what could have been, because it pushes us to begin from a different starting point. So, quote, a thinking with a twofold attention that seeks to encompass at once the positive objects and methods of history and social science, but also the matters that are absent, entangled, or unavailable by its methods, end quote. So imagining what could have been, which has always been, I think, a central part of remembering anti-colonialism, can in turn kind of maybe push us to think about the range of feelings attached to this type of imagining. We might think of melancholy, nostalgia, sadness, grief, hope. But the crucial point here that I'm interested in is that these traces do something in the present, suggesting that if they are part of an archive, we can understand this as a living archive. So what I want to do today is begin by maybe expanding a bit more on how I think about anti-colonial archiving and traces in particular. And then I'm going to turn to the first part, which looks at street signs as an archive that constantly evokes anti-colonial connections, even when they're objects that we're not always consciously absorbing as we go about our daily lives. The second part, if I have time, is going to turn towards the labor strikes that happened across Egypt throughout the 2000s. And here also thinking about the idea of haunting and how the anti-colonial past kind of haunted those strikes through the invocations that were being made. So I'll start here with anti-colonial archives. So the anti-colonial moment in Egypt is both absent and present in everyday life. And I think this absence-presence is often mediated through fragments of ideas, emotions, attachments, or images of what the past promised. If we think of this as an anti-colonial archive, it becomes clear that alongside more tangible objects, it's equally made up of things that are difficult to archive in any tangible way, uncontainable within files, rooms, buildings, or libraries. It also becomes clear that it operates on both the material and affective registers. And I'm interested, as I mentioned, in the haunting quality that comes out of this, or out of these different dimensions, and how these memories might gesture towards alternative pasts, alternatives that might still exist, and how this works to disrupt the heaviness of the present. So, like I mentioned in previous work, I looked at Egypt's anti-colonial moment from a very different vantage point. And although this project, which I in the book refer to as the Nasserist project, was particularly powerful, it also had the effect of de-radicalizing many of the movements that articulated the ideas that became associated with the Nasserist project. So the Nasserist project, I think, is a really interesting project, both in terms of its contradictions, in terms of what it promised and produced, but also the haunting kind of quality that I think we could associate with the project into the present. So what I became interested in after finishing this was more how we can articulate the feelings that are invoked by these types of anti-colonial projects that were both powerful in what they promised, but powerful as well in what they made impossible, or what they the destruction that also came about through many of their contradictions, I would say. So the project now is a bit more about these ways of articulating feeling and exploring this anti-colonial past, and thinking a bit more also about figures that were part of this project. So rather than focus on the project of Nasserism, one part of the project looks actually at Nasser himself as a figure that appears in many different spaces across the post-colonial world, including in Egypt, across the Middle East, across different African cities, as an image that almost has this kind of interesting, haunting quality. So these are just some examples of these types of images, which I found really interesting to think about precisely as traces of this past that reside in the present. So thinking back to the idea of haunting, we might turn to Arwa Saleh's writing to make sense of the events and figures that were so monumental to Egyptian politics, and yet which remain somehow unresolved in the present. And she uses this frame of haunting to underline the power inherent in such events and figures, but also to bring out the urgency that we might feel when these ghosts appear in the present. So haunting, in some sense, is a question of both a theoretical framework, but also a methodology. And as Gordon suggests, haunting for her is about the paths that have been left behind, covered, or remain unseen. And I think here, I've thought also a lot with Omnia Shakri's really crucial work on absence in relation to the history of Egypt. The difficulties inherent in making use of official archives on the one hand, but also the creative possibilities that come about when we are maybe free to imagine alternative histories or alternative archives on the other hand. And here she talks a lot about things like oral histories, letters, memoirs, that suddenly become much more important sources of history. And I want to end this little part on anti-colonial archiving by also noting a point that Stuart Hall makes in relation to archives. And he writes that no archive comes out of thin air. Every archive has a prehistory. Quote, constituting an archive represents a significant moment, one on which we need to reflect with care. It occurs at the moment when a relatively random collection of works whose movement appears simply to be propelled from one creative production to the next is at the point of becoming something more ordered and considered, an object of reflection and debate, end quote. So anti-colonial archiving then, to me, is a process that similarly calls for this care and attention, especially around this need or this movement to make it more ordered or considered or cohesive in some way. And Hall also reminds us that archives, of course, are always living. They're never inert or historical. And even when an archive might appear to be about the past, it's always reread in light of the present. And this is something I'm going to also come back to at the end. I'm going to turn now to this question of street names or street signs. And like I said, I'm especially interested in thinking about these street signs as an archive that constantly gestures towards anti-colonial connections, even when they're not objects we consciously absorb as we go about our daily lives. My interest in street names, and especially the connections between Egypt and the rest of the African continent from this perspective, actually came up from having grown up in this city. So being part of an Egyptian family that grew up in Lusaka, Zambia. And I always remembered that the main road in Lusaka is called Cairo Road. And I remember as a child always wondering why there was this road named after the city that my parents were from. And I remember it distinctly whenever I was on this road, feeling some kind of special feeling of connectivity between these two places that I felt that I was from. And As you can see here, there's obviously, there's Lumumba Road next to it, there's Freedom Way. So there's also something about many of these post-colonial cities in which street names mark this anti-colonial history in very interesting ways. And I think for a long time, I had assumed that actually Cairo Road was gesturing towards this connection between Zambia and Egypt during the 50s and 60s, but it actually wasn't. So I found out very recently that this was actually part of a project by Cecil Rhodes, so very different, to connect Cape Town and Cairo. So it was actually a much more part of a colonial imaginary. But there is a road in Lusaka called Nasser Road. So that's kind of the road that marks the kind of anti-colonial connectivity. But I think what interests me about these types of traces or these street names is that they speak to a type of material trace that I think is both absent and present. So it exists and it's invoked and maybe has particular meanings for particular people. So for me, this road had this particular meaning precisely because of my own family history. At the same time, because we often memorize street names, this invocation is not always a conscious recognition. So I think street names in some ways, like many scholars have suggested, can be thought of as a form of memory that's topographical. And I'm especially interested in thinking about the names or the street naming practices that came into being during the anti-colonial moment, almost as an attempt to fix in place the dramatic changes that were happening. So what do these names do in the present? What do they invoke? And can these invocations flare up suddenly in the present, long after the street was built and named? Many anti-colonial figures had streets named after them, monuments dedicated to them, images of them in government buildings, living rooms, protests. And this is one way, I think, in which the anti-colonial past seeps into the present, kind of reminding us of names, histories, events that created the present while belonging to a past that is very difficult to imagine. In an evocative photo essay book entitled Avenue Patrice Lumumba, Guy Tillam travels across Southern and Central Africa in search of traces of Lumumba in the architectural landscape. And describing the project, he writes, quote, "These photographs are not collapsed histories of post-colonial African states or a meditation on aspects of late modernist era colonial structures, but a walk through avenues of dreams. Patrice Lumumba's dream, his nationalism, is discernible in these structures if one reads certain clues, as is the death of his dream in these de facto monuments. How strange that modernism, which issued monument and past for nature and future, should carry memory so well," end quote. In a review of this book, Karen Irvine writes that the muted palette in the photographs produced the idea of a faded idealism in an atmosphere that is both melancholy and dreamlike. Tillam's project captures a political past. In a different and moving review essay, Deora Leka writes, quote, "Looking at Tillam's photographs, it seems that for every dream of revolutionary struggle, there is an avenue Patrice Lumumba. As Tillam finds and refines Lumumba's ghost in the thoroughfares named for him, his photographic essay draws together these dispersed avenues into a spectral cartography of liberation, uniting a network of scattered locales through their identification with this iconic figure. Such an imaginary cartography, a route linked by a single name, highlights how naming is bound up always with the writing of the landscape into history," end quote. So this act of placemaking is understood as an act of remembrance, of bringing the past into the present and therefore writing history into the landscape. Calling avenues named after Lumumba avenues of dreams, Tillam gestures towards also some kind of future, while capturing the momentous emotional registers of anti-colonialism and decolonization. Street names then have much to tell us, I think, about space, history, memory, and the future. From the vantage point of streets in Egypt, we see similar traces of connected histories. In a post written about Lumumba Street in Cairo, Amir El-Wakil notes that this street was initially named after a French general that had been active in the colonization of Egypt. And she writes a little bit about various streets across Cairo that had been undergone these name changes during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, where they were, initially had been named after these colonial figures, and then were renamed to things like Lumumba Street to kind of signal what the shift that was taking place. And I think what was really interesting is actually when I started to look for the street in Cairo named after Lumumba, I found out that there was actually a second one in Alexandria that was also named after him. And the story behind this is that Gamal Abdel Nasser had actually renamed the street in Alexandria after Lumumba in the 1950s. And it was actually the street on which the Belgian consulate was, which meant that for quite some time, they had to include his name in all correspondence. I think since then, the consulate has moved, so it's not happening anymore, but I thought that was a really kind of interesting story. What I find particularly interesting, actually, and not only in this part of the project, but across the project, is also to think a little bit about how these forms of connection tell us also a story of Egyptian African anti-colonialism. And I think having, especially coming from disciplines such as Middle East studies, I think there's often a tendency to always think of Egypt in relation to the rest of the Middle East, to think of it particularly in relation to things like Pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism. And to me, I've been much more interested in this project and also thinking about Egypt's connections to the rest of the continent. And I think this, again, has come out of my own maybe family history, but also being conscious of how many different dimensions of Pan-Africanism that Egypt was also involved in at that time. So to me, these types of connections across street names are also an interesting kind of lens into what some have called this Egyptian African anti-colonial story. And I think here, these particular streets named after Lumumba also might remind us about the massive demonstrations that took place across Cairo after the assassination of Lumumba, during which the coat of arms at the Belgian embassy was replaced with portraits of him. And interestingly, Lumumba's children actually were also able to escape from Congo and were actually taken to Egypt and brought up there. So what does it mean to kind of center these types of connectivities without necessarily producing a coherent or romantic or utopian story of Egypt or North Africa as part of this Pan-African moment, but rather thinking about how both these connections and disconnections, so again, we might think of histories of Arab slavery across the continent as a form of disconnection, but how these connections and disconnections might tell us actually quite different stories of Egypt's place within the continent more broadly. So thinking about this question of connectivity through street names, I think also raises interesting questions about space, memory, and history. As Karen Till has written, political struggles over the spatialization of social memory are principally about determining whose conception of the past should prevail in the public realm. And I think while much ink has been spilled on street naming practices, in many ways, they act as an important vehicle for bringing the past into the present and also for asserting particular political projects. Naming practices often reveal contestations over how space is understood, meaning they can allude to both erasure and remembering. And I think here, the example of the renaming of streets after anti-colonial figures is a useful example. Notably, the presence of streets named after anti-colonial figures in spaces such as Congo, Egypt, and beyond signal not only maybe that there are particularly powerful anti-colonial narratives that are used by contemporary post-colonial states, but also that they seem to signal to the impossibility of erasing these traces from the landscape and from public memory. They remain fixed in place, part of everyday life, reminding those in the present that there was a possibility of an alternative present. And I think here Gayan Pandey's description of fragments as disruptive or even disturbing is productive to think with. Changing these street names might actually grab more attention than just letting them be, and yet letting them be means they remain as traces of a past that can never be quite forgotten. These street names gesture then, I think, as I was kind of touching on earlier, to a past during which anti-colonial Egypt and anti-colonial Congo were part of the same constellation, during which Pan-Africanism extended across the continent, and during which solidarity was etched into the materiality of the city. What I'm also trying to underline, however, is that because these forms of politics were made material through city planning and naming practices, we can trace one way in which anti-colonialism is encountered in the present, as shown through Tillem's photographs and streets named after Lumumba in Cairo and Alexandria. Encountering these traces in the present might evoke a whole host of emotive reactions, including nostalgia, melancholy, maybe an uncanny feeling the past is entering the present, or maybe, as I experienced as a child, some interesting connection that I hadn't really thought of before, hadn't really thought existed. I think this juxtaposition of streets named after the faded promises of anti-colonialism, alongside ordinary scenes from the post-colonial city, suggests that life goes on in its most ordinary ways, but that the past, through both its promise and its collapse, is never as far as we think. I just want to finish this section by kind of expanding a little bit on this idea of the connections between anti-colonial Egypt and anti-colonial Congo. And some of the writing in this project, I explore also this interesting intimate connection by which we might think about Lumumba's children escaping Congo and growing up in Egypt, and the networks and ideas of solidarity that made this possible. But I think these street names more specifically might gesture towards kind of this idea of an Egyptian African story or an Egyptian African form of anti-colonialism. And in Reem Abu Fadl's translation of an Egyptian African story by Hilmi Sharawi, whose role was to organize state support for African liberation movements during the time of Nasser, we see a very different history of Egyptian anti-colonialism. He writes of the necessity of Egypt thinking or focusing on solidarity with other African countries. And I think here I was reminded as well of a really interesting interview with Egyptian filmmaker Jahan Tahri, who also has done quite a lot of work on thinking about Egypt's Pan-Africanism. And she writes as well, or she speaks as well, of this tendency of placing Egypt within the history of Middle Eastern anti-colonial projects such as Pan-Africanism, a placing that is also present within popular memory inside Egypt. And so I think this interview or these translations that are happening, but also maybe these traces are gesturing towards maybe a need for more work that thinks through Egyptian anti-colonialism in relation to the African continent, parsing out the fissures that create over and over North Africa as a separate sphere from the rest of the continent. I think thinking through these forms of connectivity that existed at this moment is one way of exploring this geographical history that pays attention to formations of race and nation in constructions of African belonging. And El-Tahri asks, who are we? Who are we as a collective, and are we a collective? And she says, quote, I'm more interested in the questions nobody is asking. Who is an Egyptian? We talk about Egyptians as though they're this one thing, but the nation state is a problematic, end quote. And just to give an example of this type of work, which is coming out now, which is really exciting. This was from a recent project called Archive of Forgetfulness, which similarly attempts to think through archives, memory, and history across the African continent, and specifically what it means to disrupt this supposed barrier between North Africa and what is problematically often referred to as sub-Saharan Africa. So what does it mean to bring out actually the fullness of the tensions and connections that have existed across these different spheres? And I think thinking from the vantage point of Egypt, these street names speak to this idea of an Egyptian African story, or to thinking about Egypt and Congo as part of the same constellation, not necessarily as a romantic or romantic story of solidarity or utopianism, but a story full of contradictions and tension, one that speaks to the politics of racism within North Africa, to histories of the Arab slave trade across the continent and stretching into the Middle East, and to histories of how cities like Cairo became central spaces of anti-colonial solidarity and imagining. I think an Egyptian African story is a story that might recenter both histories of anti-colonialism, but also histories of connections and disconnections. And as Sophia Azeb has written in relation to Algeria, we can understand the place of North Africa within Pan-Africanism as what she calls, quote, an uneven commitment to Pan-Africanism, end quote. And she writes that moments where we see this commitment to Pan-Africanism are also moments where the signifier Arab becomes less prominent, and instead a global Pan-African identity is invoked. And I think, although she notes that these moments were very fleeting, fleeting or faded moments are also increasingly important to think about. Great, so I'm going to turn now to the second section. I won't spend as much time on it because I feel like I've already talked a lot, but this is just to think through as well, and in a bit more detail, the idea of haunting. And this is based a little bit on, it's part of this project, but also based on an article that came out about a year ago that also tried to think through how ideas of Nasser and Nasserism, or ideas of anti-colonialism, appear in the present, and in particular, how they appear in the present through attempts to challenge neoliberalism and privatization in particular. So in Spectres of Marx, Derrida writes that at a time when a new world order was attempting to install neoliberalism, quote, no disavowal had managed to rid itself of all of Marx's ghosts, end quote. And in the context of Egypt, I was thinking about this quite a lot in relation to how we might think about Nasser's ghost. How does it haunt the country after his death, after the defeat of 67, the defeat more broadly of that particular project, but also after the introduction of neoliberal restructuring in the 1970s. And my main interest here was also came out of two things. I mean, one was, of course, these images of Nasser that we saw at protests, or that we've seen at protests before and after the revolution. What was being invoked, or what are the many meanings that might have been invoked by this image, and also bearing in mind, of course, that the state itself has also deployed these memories or invocations of Nasser and that project in particular ways. So how can we think about the many different ways in which his image or his project is brought into the present to do particular forms of political work? But I was also quite interested in thinking about work that has looked, or documentation of many of the strikes that took place across Egypt in the late 1990s and 2000s, and the ways in which some of this rhetoric that was being deployed by workers at the time was also this gesturing towards a particular past, or a particular anti-colonial moment in which privatization or neoliberal restructuring was not the dominant logic of the state or of the economy. And how we might think of this as a form of haunting in the present, or a particular way in which Nasserism was able to haunt kind of the neoliberal present. So neoliberal restructuring, I tried to argue, kind of brought out the ghost of Nasser in its intensification of economic inequality, recalling in the public imagination promises that had been made decades ago. The centrality of the public sector on the one hand, the notion that the state should bear some responsibility for workers' economic well-being on the other, were part of these promises. And I think what's quite interesting is that it matters less maybe that the promises were never fully fulfilled, but perhaps that they were articulated at all, or that they were put forward as a possibility, or an alternative to the colonial past. And of course, many of these promises were partially fulfilled in some ways, which again complicates this notion of these anti-colonial, post-colonial projects as having failed. But coming back to Derrida, he writes that capitalist societies always heave a sigh of relief and say to themselves, communism is finished, since the collapse of the totalitarianisms of the 20th century. Not only is it finished, but it didn't take place. It was only a ghost. They do no more than to disavow the undeniable itself. A ghost never dies. It remains always to come and to come back. And so I've been thinking a little bit about how we might also think about the haunting of the political economy of decolonization. And this was something that came up quite a lot when I was writing the book, and feeling as though there was something that wasn't being captured through this type of analysis of how the institutional or economic legacies of anti-colonialism live in the present. Because to me, there is something about the visceral remembering of this moment, or the remembering of a particular story of this moment, that does something politically as well, in terms of how people are able to challenge the neoliberal present. And so this is kind of an initial attempt to think through a bit more this idea of ghosts, also in relation to, I guess, across the world, the economic promises or the economic futures that were being imagined at this particular moment. And of course, futures that were never fully realized, but somehow being articulated as a possibility seems to have been enough for these promises to kind of appear in the present. So I'm going to just very quickly conclude now, but I'm happy to talk more about this, these economic ghosts in the Q&A. But I want to conclude by thinking also, coming back to this question of anti-colonial archiving that I raised, of what it means to think about anti-colonial archives, and perhaps also what gets left out of this story. So the talk was trying to explore this question of traces of anti-colonialism that we might see around us, as well as to think of what these traces do. And it seems to me that when we encounter or when we come across unexpected anti-colonial traces in the present, we might feel these senses of nostalgia, of melancholy, of rupture, perhaps thinking about what that moment represented or what it could have been. But it can also lead, I think, to a political urge, maybe an urge to engage in some form of politics that might speak to these anti-colonial promises or failures. And yet the crucial point to me is that these traces are doing something in the present, and whether this means we can or should think about them as some kind of a living archive. At the same time, I also wanted to think a bit more about what these traces leave out of the story of anti-colonial archives, and how this speaks to the impossibility of archiving. And here I've thought a lot with an excellent article by Sara Salem entitled "Remembering the 1977 Bread Riots in Suez, Fragments and Ghosts of Resistance." And in this article, she looks at this particular moment in Egyptian history where there were massive protests against attempts by the government to remove bread subsidies. And she argues that the main participants in these protests are not actually accessible. We don't really, through her research, she argues that it was impossible to actually find out who protested at these protests, and that she refers to them as actively absent. So in this article, she asks us to think about also who can become a ghost and how. Where Nasser might be a ghost in the sense that the immense power that he wielded is evoked through representational traces like street names or images. Those who were active during protests, including protests that we would probably understand as part of Nasser's legacy, are rendered ghostly in a different way. So she argues that they're ghosts because they haven't and could not have left the same types of traces behind. It's only through a careful process of collecting oral histories that she unearths what she calls fragments of the history of Suez 1977. And she writes, quote, "Everyone that I spoke to insisted that they themselves were not actually at the protests and that no one knew exactly who the protesters were," end quote. Who then carried out these protests that would change the course of the 1970s? She writes that they were subjected to a process of absencing, where people are actively made absent in public space. And so this is kind of produce a lot of questions also around this idea of anti-colonial archives, thinking of who can leave traces to account for themselves and who can't. And thinking a bit more deeply about this notion that traces and fragments are by nature incomplete, often appear without context or narrative. And the traces that we do have, although they have much to tell us about the project of anti-colonialism, its hopes, its failures, at the same time are always similarly creating a center at which other margins or other forms of traces maybe become less part of the stories that we're telling. So I don't know what my point here is, but more just to kind of think about how even in this project, this discomfort against similarly centering these big figures of anti-colonialism, precisely because these are the traces that we often have left behind if we're thinking of things like street names or photographs or public spaces, and also to kind of always be aware of what limitations this might create around the anti-colonial archive as well. So I think I'll stop here. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah, for that brilliant talk. It was really, really interesting to listen to you. It was really interesting listening to you, Sarah, talk about the kind of histories of Pan-Africanism in Egypt. I don't know if it's just because I've had quite a parochial education myself, but typically when we learn about Pan-Africanism, we never really hear too much about countries like Egypt and their involvement in it. Why do you think that we have those kinds of absences? And how do you kind of address that now when you're teaching classes at the LSE or giving talks at organizations like this and so on?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really great question. And I think there's multiple reasons for this maybe absence. I think a big part of it is that Egypt's own telling of this particular moment, or the tellings that we might hear more dominantly in the region, similarly reproduce this idea that we can understand Egypt's project through its connections to Arab nationalism or Pan-Arabism. And so I think one of the main stories that we hear about Egyptian anti-colonialism, even in Egypt or in the region, is precisely actually a story of Egyptian-Arab connection. So I think on one level, there is a way in which narratives coming from Egypt themselves tend to center some forms of connection over others. I think another reason is also that the disconnections that have been produced and reproduced between kind of North Africa and the rest of the continent also need so much more, I think, work and attention to really fully bring out also the tensions that have existed and the ways in which places like Egypt have been produced as, or racialized also as, Arab or closer to whiteness in distinction to the rest of the continent. So I think that type of work, again, reading always these histories of solidarity alongside also the histories of, very violent histories as well of the Arab slave trade, for example, I think is really important. And I think that is also work that there's still so much left to really think about. Well, what were the processes of racialization that were produced in relation to these historical events within the continent, for example, and that have connected as well the continent to a space like the Middle East, to Asia, and so on. So I think that's another part of it, is that both the tendency to sometimes when we tell the story of Egyptian Pan-Africanism, to not read that alongside also why, this history of solidarity was very fleeting, I think, in relation to also other histories, is part of the issue. I think another thing is just disciplinary as well. I mean, even I remember doing, masters and PhDs, like when you work on Egypt or work on something to do with Egypt, the idea is always that this is the Middle East. Those are the conferences you go to. Those are the cases you're thinking alongside. And it was really interesting to me when I was working on my PhD, for example, how there was much more in common when thinking about Nasserism in relation to Kenya or Tanzania than in relation to, for example, Saudi Arabia or Syria, right? But there is this constant push towards thinking relationally only in one direction. So I think there's actually quite a lot there as well about this disciplinary pressure, I think, that exists, that also creates the types of narratives that we, or the types of connections we focus on at the expense of others. And I think part of challenge and part of teaching differently is also about bringing out very different types of connections or forms of relationality. So, for example, in the course, we've actually also spent a lot of time thinking, for example, about work on the Indian Ocean, and thinking about actually the ocean as a space, because it kind of completely orients you very differently to the ways in which like Africa and Asia have been connected over time that became radically transformed only very recently. So how can we maybe also geographically disrupt some of these ways in which we imagine projects, and would that also make us revisit what Pan-Africanism included or what Pan-Arabism included, without, again, undermining obviously the violent histories that have been part of why Egypt has not been associated itself maybe with Pan-Africanism, for example.
That's really, really interesting. Thanks for engaging with that question. We have a couple of people that want to ask questions. First, I'll go to Khaled, and then I've got a question from Anna, which I'll come to in the chat afterwards. Khaled, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, those are really fascinating questions. I mean, yeah, I think that it's an interesting question about how being on these streets or for example, experiencing street names that have these maybe revolutionary names or histories, what it produces politically or in terms of action is really fascinating. I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about is also in relation to work by Nouri Ghani is this idea of how emotional reactions can also produce particular forms of politics or particular ways of working through the past. So his work looks at things like melancholy or nostalgia, and how we often think of these emotions as just things we feel, but that don't do anything beyond that. But people like, Walter Benjamin have argued that melancholy can also be very productive because it's signaling that there's something that's unresolved, or that something about the past that is very heavy that needs you to kind of work through or to resolve in order to let it go. And so I've been thinking a bit about, this idea of haunting, because haunting suggests precisely that the past is still troubled, or there's something that hasn't been worked through or resolved in terms of the past. And until that happens, there will be this feeling of being stuck or being haunted. And so I wonder if that is also a form of political action, to just work through the past, to think about the ghosts of the past as something that is blocking the creation of a different type of future. So yeah, it's not a very developed answer, but definitely something I've been thinking about is what types of politics can come out of these feelings of melancholy or nostalgia, or even hopelessness, or that we might feel when we encounter these revolutionary traces of either revolution now. I think even with the recent revolution, this feeling of being stuck or hopeless or exhausted, I think also produces a form of politics, even if it's not yet clear what it is. So yeah, definitely something I want to think more about. I think your point is really interesting about, are the ghosts being haunted by other ghosts? Because I think that, I also wonder, and something I've been thinking about while working on this is, who is being haunted by which ghost? Are we all being haunted by Nasser's ghost, or are there kind of these different layers to the story that complicate this idea of who is doing the haunting? And I wonder as well if actually in Arwa Saleh's memoir, for example, she talks a lot about being haunted, but I think what she is haunted by is not Nasser's ghost, but actually the ghosts of the communists or leftists who were imprisoned by him, because for her that signaled the failure of that she was complicit in, right, or the failure that the Egyptian left was complicit in by allying with Nasser's project. And so I think in her memoir you actually see a very different type of haunting, which is being haunted by the people who are imprisoned or who lost their lives to this project that the left was complicit or entangled in. And she kind of throughout the memoir is talking about how the mistake of the Egyptian left was that it gave into nationalism. It put nationalism over this question of class or this question of communism. And so it got too close to this project. And so I always feel like, I wonder if the ghosts she's being haunted by are the ghosts you mentioned, right? These ghosts who protested or who were the victims of this security state throughout these different decades. Not necessarily the ghost of Nasser himself or the ghost of these big figures. So yeah, just thinking out loud, but it's really interesting also to ask, to think about who is haunted by what and what that can also tell us about how they remember the past. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Khaled. Thanks, Sarah, for engaging with those questions. Paul, I've noticed that your hand is raised, but first I'm going to come to a question from Anna, who asked something to me in a private message. Anna's asking you, Sara, if you're able to speak a little about possible imaginations of anti-colonial photographic archives. So she's saying that Satari's Arab Image Foundation comes to mind, but that's centered as Arab/white adjacent. Have you come across any Pan-African anti-colonial photography archives? And do you think that this is even possible?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. That's a great question. I mean, I think one archive that I found really interesting was this this book that I mentioned in the talk, which is Guy Tillem's book about Avenue Patrice Lumumba. And I mean, I think there are obviously things about it that you might be critical of, but I think it's a very interesting positioning of the post-colonial city through an anti-colonial lens. So he, you know, the photos in this photo book or collection are actually of all types of statues or street names or any type of physical marker that alludes to anti-colonialism across Southern Africa. And so it's a very interesting photographic archive that talks about these traces. But I think what's fascinating about it is that he's not also positioning them as either nostalgic or as ruined. So I think there is this tendency sometimes to also look at these traces as just through this idea of ruination, or as things that are part of how the post-colonial city has kind of fallen apart. But I think what he really consciously does is actually see them as very active in the present, and is similarly interested in what these photographs can produce. Can they produce a very different narrative of anti-colonial connectivity across the continent? So I think that was one collection of photos that I think would speak well to this idea of a Pan-African photographic archive. I think alongside that, my sense is that a lot of these archives would probably be found more in kind of personal collections or intimate collections. So for example, when I started to work on this project, I initially was really interested in these images of Nasser that appear in different cities or different towns. So either these faded kind of posters on walls, and so I had asked people to just send me any images that they have. And what was really interesting is that a lot of them were actually from people's like homes, so living rooms or pictures of Nasser that people had framed like in their bedroom. I mean, these very intimate actually spaces. And this has made me think also a lot more about Omnea Shakri's point that when we don't have these extensive national archives or they're closed to us, as in the case of Egypt, the intimate collections that people have become much more important. So I think I wonder also about, the space of the intimate as a space where we might find a lot more of these types of collections. And I think that would also make us maybe think about what a Pan-African kind of photographic archive would be. It could also just be these everyday scenes, not necessarily these big figures or these statues, but also just everyday life and what types of life were made possible during the Pan-African moment, which is also quite important. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Sarah. So next we'll go to Paul, and then we'll go to Awa afterwards. So Paul, do you want to ask your question first?
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. That was extremely enjoyable. I'm also interested in traces of the past futures of decolonization in Africa, and especially in the sort of our own tracing of the effective resonances of these traces. So the first part of your talk especially interested me. And what I really liked about your example with Cairo Street was your pursuit of a failed, if you wish, or a somewhat erroneous affective connotation that you had with this street, and not with the parallel streets for Lumumba and so on. So I really enjoyed this because in the work that we're doing, we're also interested in the feeling of connections to past unfulfilled futures or moments of progress. What I was wondering about, though, is this we that you used, which is quite clear and simple in the Cairo example. I mean, that's you're obviously positioned in a particular way in relation to the road and to Cairo and to Lusaka. So that's a straightforward one. But otherwise, in the haunting or hauntology literature, there's a tendency to just sort of assume a we, speaking out of the authors being haunted by one thing or the other, which sometimes can be quite problematic if you have, classic examples are Eden Soul with a sort of middle class white positioning in industrial remains, which often has been criticized as somehow being problematic. And this kind of question of positioning becomes especially problematic if you work as a white positioned ontologist or tracer in Africa. Because what we do actually, what resonances do you pick up and what claims do you make to we? And I asked my question because there's one possible response to this that is like sort of, forget it, don't go with that thing to Africa, which, for example, contemporary archaeologists of Africa have argued that this sort of ontology, archaeology of us thing, don't do it there because you're getting in specific, overdetermined fields of difference. The alternative would be what you seem to do is to actively pursue that we, no matter what contradictions it leads you to. And I would think that is also a possible political position. I mean, because through following these, however contradictory and messy resonances, you're also potentially producing a we that transcends the predictable modes of differentiation of class and race that this field consists in. So I was just wondering whether you could comment more on the political import of this somewhat idiosyncratic, somewhat personal pursuit of resonances. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, thank you, Paul. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I was thinking about a lot in relation, especially to the street names in Cairo and Alexandria. So I think exactly like you said, in Lusaka, it was easier for me to kind of talk about the feelings I felt in relation to this road and position that again as more of this intimate story, in which the we is very clear and is not claiming to go beyond that. Whereas I think I was thinking about this again in relation to who is the we then in Cairo or Alexandria who's looking at Lumumba Road. What are they feeling? And can we even assume that to know that they would be feeling things like nostalgia or melancholy, or might not know who this figure is or what this history is. So I think it kind of made me think about what does it mean also to talk about these. I think this is a difficulty with the affective side of it, is the we becomes very important, and at the same time, it's also about avoiding, I think, the extreme interiorization of it. I think sometimes with some work on affect, there can be this tendency to then really go inwards to say, and the individual becomes again this site of privilege over maybe these broader kind of societal sensations. So I think this tension has been something I've been thinking about. And to me, what was easier, for example, in looking at the way workers deployed these ideas of the anti-colonial past in the present, in those types of examples, that again became a bit easier to articulate that this is a particular we that is invoking a particular past, and we can analyze why they're doing this through their own positioning, their own experiences of neoliberalism, their own kind of also understanding of what Nasserism was, and not necessarily say that this is something that went beyond that. So I think the way I've tried to negotiate this is precisely by always thinking about who is being haunted and by what, and how can we see that without making the claim that there is a bigger we than maybe this particular instance or this particular moment where someone is invoking the past or a group of people are invoking the past. At the same time, I do feel like there are these moments in which there is a sense of a society being haunted, and those are this is where the challenge, I think, comes in sometimes. So I remember in Egypt after the 2011 revolution, there was this sense, or I remember a lot of writing or commentary coming out about the ghosts of the past. So how this revolution was haunted also by Nasser or by this other revolution that happened. And in that case, it was this idea of, the country or society or revolutionaries, which are such big categories, and you don't want to necessarily reproduce this homogenizing tendency, but at the same time, there was something that was happening at that scale. So how do we make space for both the possibility that this haunting is happening at this large scale at this particular moment, but still make space for obviously the reality that people are experiencing it in different ways, or people might be being haunted by different things. So I think coming back to Khalid's question, to me, reading, for example, the work of Egyptian leftists is very different from reading from the work maybe of like the strikers who are using these invocations in the present, because for the left, it's a much more complicated relationship with that moment. And so the haunting they're haunted almost by their own complicity in this project, whereas in the strikes, we're not seeing that type of entanglement. We're seeing a much more clearer kind of invocation of this was a moment where the state had responsibilities that we can see being eroded now, and how can we bring this back into the present? So yeah, I don't know if this has answered any of it, but it is a tension, I think, in kind of thinking about haunting at these different scales and these different levels, and also these different geographical spaces, because I also want to be careful to note that this is thinking about these connections from Egypt. I think thinking about these connections from Zambia or Congo would look very different. And I think it's also important to note that thinking about the connectivity or disconnectivity of Egypt from the continent from Egypt is, because Egypt is obviously entangled within that very differently than somewhere like Zambia or Congo. So also making clear that it's not an assumption that this is also how people in Lusaka might feel about Nasser Road or Cairo Road. So yeah, I think it's very difficult. I think it's a constant process of kind of moving between these different scales, or moving between these individual experiences, but also thinking about how they connect people who might be experiencing the same thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Sara, for that really thoughtful response. Awa, do you want to ask your question now?
Hi, Sara. Thank you so much for that really, oh, sorry, let me just turn on. Thank you for that really interesting presentation. The questions got me thinking a little bit about sort of Nasser's legacy, especially today amongst Egyptians. You know, thinking more broadly about sort of his more violent role in sort of like Yemen and Palestine. And I know you touched on this in terms of like the haunting aspect, but I was interested to know if there's sort of like a generational difference in the way that his legacy has been upheld today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's such an interesting question, because I feel like I've often felt, for example, talking to friends from like the Gulf or Palestine, that there's a very different remembering of Nasser that happens than in Egypt, especially with younger people, where my sense is that there isn't actually a very strong nostalgia for that time. And often there is this generational gap, like you're saying, because for many of us, or at least for me, you know, like someone like my dad was able to go to university because of many of the changes that happened at this time, right? Education was made free, employment was guaranteed. So there are all these interesting shifts that happened under Nasser that really affected, I think, that entire generation, especially in terms of things like social mobility. And so I think that generation often, from what I see, has this much more complicated relationship, or sometimes maybe more nostalgic. I think it's very hard to generalize, but I think in my experience with younger or different generations, there is also this line that they draw between the present and the past, where especially the military kind of regime that's in power, it's this, you know, this is often understood also as a legacy of this post-colonial moment that is not at all seen positively. So I think that it's a much more contentious kind of remembering or thinking about the legacy of that moment as also the moment that solidified military power, that created a lot of the institutions, the police institutions that people are like living with today. So I think that is also part of how that moment is remembered. I think even generationally, though, there are these important divisions. So thinking, for example, about Nasser's project to build the Aswan Dam and the displacement of Nubians, for instance. So even the violence of that project, I think, even at that time for that generation, there were people that experienced it very differently than necessarily as this project of social mobility and futurism and kind of independence, but also as a project of violence and displacement within Egypt itself. And of course, in Yemen and those, you know, the projects that he was engaged in regionally. So yeah, so I think there is a generational split, but even within that older generation, I think there are these important divisions in terms of how people were affected by this project, and how much of what the project was able to achieve economically was also dependent on this violence, for example, of Nubian displacement, or the violence of certain forms of labor relations in factories and so on. So yeah, I think it's a really important question, but I think what I was saying at the beginning also, what's interesting is that this really varies regionally. So I feel as though conversations with friends in different countries, there sometimes is this tension around Nasser being remembered more positively as this icon of third worldism, of you know, independence, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, versus within Egypt, not it being a much more complex remembering, I think, because of the present as well, and the legacies that were put in place at that time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sara, for engaging with that question. Does anyone else have any questions they want to ask before we close? Lindsay has raised their hand. Lindsay, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to thank you for your talk, Sara. It was very informative. And I really appreciated the idea of thinking and remembering in complexity, and especially the the work that you do to highlight Egypt's connection to the rest of Africa is really, really good. One thing I was thinking about is when you're thinking about the street names, given that like cartography and mapping is really emerges through the colonial project. You know, Timothy Mitchell writes about like the city of Cairo and how it's mapping and like the territorial expansion of the space is really a part of the colonial project. I was wondering, like, if you explore in your book how the street naming, the haunting through the street naming is like happening alongside a haunting, like a colonial haunting of the city, and maybe what that would mean for like those hauntings to be happening in parallel or in conjunction. And also just like how you're thinking more broadly about the relationship between like mapping and cartography and like naming, like the physicality and then the naming, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, yeah, it's been really interesting because I've been working on this other project with Minna Aghahu, and it's on radical ideas of mapping across the African continent that tries to exactly think about this question of there is this colonial history to mapping and cartography and dividing up space on the one hand, and on the other hand, there are many other ways in which people have thought about space or navigated space or created other types of mapping, forms of mapping. And so it's been such a great project. It's called Disembodied Territories, because it really is this attempt to bring this contradiction out rather than to necessarily pretend that it doesn't exist, but also to ask this question, should we give mapping up because of this particular history, all types of mapping, or are there particular forms of mapping that we should be much more careful about? So your question made me realize I haven't really thought about this in relation to this project, which is really interesting because, of course, many of, I mean, if we're thinking about cities like Cairo or Lusaka, like the parceling up of space into these types of streets with these particular street names is also part of this colonial history. And so that contradiction is also quite interesting, like that renaming a street that in and of itself we could already understand as part of this colonial heritage. What does that do? And how does it also speak exactly to where these streets actually, where these streets came from, or a particular form of city making in which these street names become the way in which people navigate a space. So yeah, it's really definitely something I want to think about more. Or, I mean, my sense is always to think about forms of disruption that came about through anti-colonialism that maybe we're not able to completely overturn the coloniality of something, but that do disrupt or that do kind of make us pause when we come across them. And I think there is something quite interesting about these street names that do that, even though, of course, the streets themselves or the way they organize space is still part of this colonial heritage. So yeah, and there's been some really interesting work on this in the context of Algeria as well. I forget her name now, but really fascinating book also about how during this war of liberation against France, street names became a very politicized space, even though these, of course, were the streets that were built through colonialism, but they became so politicized because the naming of them signaled this important shift after independence. So yeah, I think I would say think about them as disruptions rather than as transformations, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks, Sarah. Do we have any other questions before we close? Sarah, one thing that we really like to ask people that come to give a talk is just if they can make a recommendation of a reading that's really helped shape kind of like your intellectual positioning, or something that you just like to share with us that you think we could all benefit from reading. Is there anything that jumps to your mind?
Ooh, that is a good question. I'm gonna say, because this is in front of me, like I'm gonna say this Carol Boyce Davies's book on Claudia Jones, Left of Karl Marx, because it's not very related to this project, but I think that was a book that really shifted the way I thought also about Marxism and how to think about more creatively about kind of anti-capitalism and Marxism. So that's definitely one. I think one related to this project would probably be Avery Gordon's book, Ghostly Matters, because that was really, and it is also a book about sociology, so that's helpful, but it really made me rethink a lot of kind of what I had thought about methodology as well. So I think those two.
Sounds like two really good recommendations, which I hope all of us are putting on our lists. Thank you so much for coming to give this talk, Sarah. I really had such a great time listening to you, and I think that we all really appreciate you giving up an hour and a half of your time to come and talk to us on Zoom. We know it's not the best platform to be doing this, but we really enjoyed it.